Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. It's a great pleasure to discuss in this live stream Martin Heidegger and the enigma of being, thinking more about the philosophy, the phenomenology of Martin Heidegger, and his contributions to the history of phenomenology, and even more, the history of Western philosophy. There are many contributions, and we cannot understand where phenomenology is now in the 21st century without passing through Heidegger's extension and broadening of what Husserl is doing with the phenomenological reduction to givenness in Husserl and eidetic objectivity of phenomena. They give themselves essentially all the way into the heart of consciousness of the human subject. So I've been working to improve the live stream in terms of the sound and the quality. So I'm not going to share my screen. I think that's where I was having trouble before. But instead, I'm going to use a dry erase board to write on. It's a little more clunky than being able to share the screen, but it's something in order to highlight concepts as we go. And I might begin with just a few of these, thinking about the phenomenology of Heidegger. Heidegger and his phenomenological reduction to givenness, yes, but an attentiveness to lived experience. Erlebnis is lived experience in general, but thinking about Erlebnis in terms of the German word Ereignis. Erlebnis as Ereignis. Ereignis means an event. Understanding the phenomenon not just in a kind of objective essence that's giving itself to the subjectivity of conscience, but also in terms of how the phenomenon gives itself along the horizon of givenness, and especially in terms of being, sein, showing itself, revealing itself, sein, revealing itself through Seienden. So being revealing itself through beings. Beings as phenomena. So this is Heidegger. That being shows itself through beings along the horizon of the Umwelt, the world of phenomenological revelation, the self-revelation of being, is giving itself through phenomena. So being is not itself a phenomenon, but the invisible, ever-present horizon of phenomenality. So the human subject appropriates through this eventing of phenomena. Ereignis is an appropriation of phenomenal givenness for subjectivity. So the question, what does it mean for me? What does it mean in this context of the self-revelation of being? What is the meaning of being giving itself through the phenomena he calls beings? Every essential phenomenon, every meaning, every signification. But again, for Heidegger, the focus is on lived experience as the eventfulness of meaning in the Umwelt, in this world horizon of givenness, And what's being given ultimately, above all and always, is Sein, being. Again, not a metaphysical concept of being, but being as the very character of givenness. So the dramatics of being given, the enigma of being in Heidegger. So let's take some more text of Heidegger. Again, it's an appreciation of Husserl's attentiveness to phenomenological immanence, but it's an inversion of the same immanence toward transcendence and the movement toward an investigation, an ongoing investigation, a perpetual investigation of Sein and how Sein, being, gives itself through Seienden, beings, phenomena. But it's an investigation not of this phenomenon and that phenomenon alone and their eidetic objectivity that we have in Husserl, but it's an investigation of the horizon of givenness itself, which has an unlimited terrain to investigate, an unlimited field of vision, of perception, of receptivity. So transcendence for Heidegger is a more positive term than in Husserl. For Husserl, transcendent data are second-rate data for phenomenology. But what Husserl is after is immanent data in the interior of consciousness, which are always unified to the giving phenomenon outside the self, but giving itself all the way to the inside of the self. Heidegger says, okay, but what is this horizon of givenness through which phenomena give themselves? These more hermeneutical questions, much more hermeneutical questions with Heidegger. So Heidegger recognizes the essential movement of phenomenal manifestation from unapparent to apparent, from non-appearance to appearance, from concealment to disclosure. We have a quote here from Being in Time, section 7. Heidegger writes, manifestly, a phenomenon is something that proximally, and for the most part, does not show itself at all. It is something that lies hidden. Again, that is transcendent. Every phenomenon bears the umbra of transcendence. In contrast to that which proximally and for the most part does show itself. But at the same time, the phenomenon is something that belongs to what shows itself, and it belongs to it so essentially as to constitute its meaning and its ground. So for Heidegger, he could say something like, so much revelation, so much concealment. Heidegger's phenomenology is rather mystical compared to that of Husserl. Heidegger's phenomenology is rather mystical. So again, it is being showing itself through the eventfulness of being along the horizon of disclosure. But it's a horizon precisely because there is that which is revealed and that which remains concealed. If you look over a large body of water, you see a horizon. It comes across as a signification of what you can see, but also beyond. There's a beyond what you cannot see. And Heidegger is saying this is the case with phenomena. So theologically speaking, there's a very high degree of what we call apophaticism in Heidegger, a lingering, perpetual, abiding hiddenness, concealment, all the while there is much revelation of phenomena. And what especially remains concealed within lived experience is Sein, being, for all that we say about being, for all the ways we approach being, for all the ways that Dasein, the analytic of subjectivity, investigates being, it is eluding our grasp, our perception. There's always something beyond the horizon, and it is Sein. But nevertheless, Sein self-discloses itself in its mysterious, saturating, infinite phenomenality through concrete, delimited phenomena, beings. So this is what Heidegger is getting at. Within this phenomenal movement of manifestation, there is always something that remains hidden. Again, for Heidegger specifically, being itself remains hidden, Sein, or more precisely what he calls Wahrheit des Seins, the truth of being remains hidden, mysterious, not fully shown, not fully appearing. As Marion writes in his book Reduction and Givenness, in interpreting Heidegger, that which in the phenomenon requires the phenomenological work of unveiling, precisely because of itself it remains concealed, is nothing less than the always veiled unveiling of the truth. This is very paradoxical. In Heidegger, we get this high degree of the phenomenality of paradox. Again, with a kind of maxim, so much revelation, so much concealment, so much unveiling, so much veiling. And from the Greek meaning of Greek word for truth, aletheia, is a removal of the veil, truth showing itself, becoming manifest, becoming known, perceivable. But for Heidegger, with as much degree of perception, there's as much, if not more, concealment, veiling. The ground and source of all phenomenality, therefore, is the disclosure, concealment dynamic of being, Sein, that only can be given intuitively and enigmatically through the inquiry of Dasein. Phenomenologically speaking, the more radical and extreme the questioning becomes, the more directly can the inquirer be admitted into the realm of disclosure. This is very interesting. This is a quote from Shallow's book, Frank Shallow's book, Heidegger and the Quest for the Sacred, From Thought to the Sanctuary of Faith, 2001 book. So again, I'm quoting from my 2017 book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist, An Etude in Phenomenology, forward by Jean-Luc Marion. And so I appreciate Frank Shallow's analysis here, that for Heidegger, phenomenologically speaking, the more radical and extreme the questioning becomes, the more directly can the inquirer be admitted into the realm of disclosure. This is a wonderful truth about philosophy. The more questions we ask, and the deeper their freight, the more we're admitted into this Heideggerian realm of the self-disclosure of Sein, of being. We're admitted into the arena of the mysterious self-disclosure of being through the very act of questioning, and what philosophy historically calls, and we say in German, the Seinsfrage. Aristotle is asking the question. All the pre-Socratic philosophers are asking the question. Thales, Heraclitus, Anaxagoras, Parmenides. All of these philosophers raise the question of being, and they approach it in different ways. Sometimes more materially, sometimes more formally or spiritually. The difference between Parmenides and Heraclitus. For Parmenides, being is. For Heraclitus, being is in flux. You never walk through the same river twice. But for Parmenides, he says being is not lacking. If it were, it would lack everything. So they both are hitting upon the truth of being from different complementary angles. And we can say the same is true for Husserl and Heidegger. For Husserl, the phenomenon gives itself by itself. We arrive at the things themselves. But Heidegger is also asking about what is this um, perpetual, necessary uh, horizon of the self-disclosure of a phenomenon, and moreover, the backdrop of the self-disclosure of each and every phenomenon that we could call something like the umbra of phenomenality, the context, the milieu, the environment, again in German, the Umwelt. Heidegger is drawing our attention to all of this. And he's also drawing our attention to the investigator. Who is the one doing the investigating? So though he could agree with Husserl that psychologism is a problem for thought, we don't get at the things themselves with psychologism, but we get at only the process of thought, and this individual's thinking and that individual's thinking, this individual's experience and that individual's experience. But what is universal about experience? This is what phenomenology is after. What is universal about being? Not just being as I want to make it out to be, but being as it gives itself to you and to I, to us, to everyone in a global, universal way. So Heidegger is saying we also have a global, universal concept of subjectivity, and he's calling it Dasein, being there. Being there. This disclosedness is formed in part by a projection, Shallow says in his book, Heidegger and the Quest for the Sacred. The disclosedness of being, or the revelation of being, is formed in part by a projection which brings to the forefront Dasein's potentiality to be. And this is where Heidegger talks about authentic possibilities of being for Dasein, for the human subject. We live more authentically to the heightened degree of raising the Seinsfrage, of raising the question of being, of not being content with a pragmatic world of supply and demand, of costs and products, of what Heidegger calls the chatter of people and pastimes. But we move from the realm of the inauthentic, kind of living on autopilot, perhaps being a puppet of desires or whatever is nearby. And we move into the realm of authenticity to the degree that Dasein, its potentiality to be, is actualized by entering into the unpredictable, enigmatic world of the Seinsfrage and asking with great risk, what gives in terms of being? What gives being? What does being give? What is the givenness of being? This is a great investigation. Thus, Dasein, selfhood, is granted as an outgrowth of its surpassing beyond and over to those possibilities which encompass a network of worldly involvements. That's the key word, network, horizon, enmeshment in a density of givenness. What Paul Ricoeur will later call being enmeshed in a density of text. But first, for Heidegger, it's being enmeshed and enveloped in a density of manifestation, a sea of manifestation. It's as if we are, fish living in a sea of manifestation. It's the air we breathe. But the Seinsfrage causes us to ask about the phenomenality of this breathing. So Dasein selfhood is authentic selfhood is granted as an outgrowth of its surpassing beyond and over to those possibilities which encompass a network of worldly involvements of being in the world. So for Heidegger, it's another original concept. Heidegger's work is full of originality which is coming through the method of phenomenology and gathering up all of this various givenness of meaning and signification that is there in every lived experience. If we take the time and have the courage to investigate it, to slow down and ponder, to slow down and philosophize, to give ourselves space and time to ask these questions of meaning. So then we understand being, not being qua being alone, not in a metaphysical sense alone, but being as dynamic. The self-revelation of being that has to do with our being in the world, with Dasein's being in the world. Heidegger describes this process of surpassing, which epitomizes and brings to light our thrownness into the world, namely transcendence. The transcendence of experience. There's always something transcendent about experience, not in a relativistic way, but in a universal way. Transcendence is a defining feature of experience in as much as not only es gibt, but es weltet. Not only because of the given phenomenon, but the givenness of context, of a network of relations concerning all of the phenomena that give themselves in lived experience, which Husserl is so attentive to, but also the horizon and the event of appropriation of the self-revelation of being for the movement toward greater authenticity of Dasein, of the human subject. So Marion, in his book, Reduction and Givenness, writes about this progression in the history of phenomenology from Husserl to Heidegger, as he says, the phenomenon had to pass from evident presence in Husserl, in this eidetic objectivity, to the enigma of play within it, as in Heidegger, between the unapparent and the apparent, only in order to be able to give rise to the phenomenality of being, of Sein, which par excellence is covered over in the very uncovering of beings, since it brings about that uncovering. Again, for Heidegger, when it comes to the phenomenon, when it comes to the Seinsfrage, the question of being, so much disclosure, so much concealment, so much unveiling, so much veiling. In other words, for the show to go on with phenomenological givenness, there is perpetual veil, concealment. So we peel back the onion. We continue to peel back the onion in as much as we never get to the core. This is Erlebnis as Ereignis, as an unfathomable origin of experience. That for there to be the next one and the previous one, the veil remains for a temporary, a passing unveiling. But with the unveiling, there's still the phenomenality of the veil. With every disclosure, it implies there was a concealment, is a concealment, will be a concealment. This is the case with experience. We never get full disclosure with experience. Sometimes we say that humorously in speech, full disclosure, let me make a confession, let me lay down the cards, let me expose the fine print. But in Heidegger, in this phenomenology, there's never full disclosure of being. And that's simply from describing its phenomenality. That's simply from describing the how, not defining the infinite as such, the eternal as such, not talking about divinity even in Heidegger's methodological atheism, but simply talking about the experience of experience. This is phenomenology. To think about and to talk about the experience of experience in the classical philosophical terms of being, for Heidegger, we have a revolutionary way of approaching the question of being through the method of phenomenology without getting theological. I remember being in class with Jean-Luc Marion at the University of Chicago. We were studying Sein und Zeit, being and time of Heidegger, and I asked him, what's the difference between the relationship between Sein and Seienden and God and creatures? Like, it seems like a theology is being spun here in terms of the self-revelation of Sein. And he said, no, for Heidegger, this is a purely rational project. There's no reference to divine revelation, personalized divine revelation. It's a kind of anonymity of being, universality of being as dynamic concept, but not a personification of being. Sein is impersonal still for Heidegger because it's not divine. It's not divinity, but it's very close to it within a rational order of things. But Heidegger maintains this religious indifference, even though he's raised Catholic. He distances himself from any appeal or reference to divine revelation in his philosophy. For Marion, there's a whole different thing going on there, which I'll talk about later in talking about Marion's phenomenology. But first, we want to understand Heidegger. Even as a prelude to theology, this is something I appreciate with Heidegger's thought in relation to the possibilities of divinity and divine revelation. Heidegger at least sets up this dynamism, this more dynamic investigation of being, this more dynamic way of asking philosophical questions, where we don't just have question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. It's not that we have no answer. It's not that we have no clarity, but what's more decisive for Heidegger than epistemological clarity is the clarity of authenticity for Dasein. That it's risking asking the question, exposing itself, and thereby becoming its more authentic self. It's a kind of pas de deux between Dasein and Sein in Heidegger. And it's like the more we encounter the disclosure of being, the more we're at the same time encountering its concealment. The more we encounter the concealment of being, the more Dasein is being revealed to itself in its authentic ipseity, but dynamic ipseity, selfhood. So, to quote Heidegger, Being in Time, section 44, Dasein is constituted by disclosedness. It becomes more authentic. It knows itself better. The classic Greek axiom, know thyself. Dasein gets to know itself better. Self grows in self-knowledge and authenticity when it encounters the truth about being and the dynamic self-revelation of being. Dasein moves toward greater self-knowledge and authentic selfhood. Disclosedness, revealedness, manifestation is a kind of being which is essential to Dasein. Too. So there's a self-showing of being and a self-showing of the self, vis-a-vis being, for Heidegger. Wahrheit gibt es. We'd say there is truth, but more literally, truth gives itself. Only insofar as Dasein is And so long as Dasein is, truth is something that is dealt with by Dasein. Again, the meaning of Dasein. Sein, what's the difference between Dasein and Sein? We see there's the same word there, Sein and Sein, but the there. So the one, the human subject who has the privilege of detecting the there-ness of being, of selfhood, of the phenomenon, of the epiphany of everything, including selfhood, the privilege of the Da for Heidegger, the there-ness, the attentiveness. But the Da als Gift, the there as gift, givenness, Gegebenheit, through the matrix of meaning that is Wahrheit and as Weltet, this worlding of the worlds, again, the self-disclosure of being. So entities, Seienden, are uncovered only when Dasein is, and only as long as Dasein is, are they disclosed. Entities, Seienden, or beings, depending on the English translation. But again, not a metaphysical sense of isness here. It's a dynamic isness, Dasein, being there, vis-a-vis being, and its showcase on the world stage of the Umwelt through this Ereignis, the appropriation of the question of being and the receptivity of this phenomenology of being. So, for Heidegger, being is given intuitively and enigmatically through the inquiry of Dasein. Being, Sein, however, can never be disclosed, exhausted, or comprehended fully by Dasein, because being remains nothing of a being and is nothing visible. So this is similar to the Latin distinction between esse and ens. Two words we translate being, but ens is being as noun, esse being as verb, being itself. Ipsum esse subsistens, self-subsisting being itself, existence itself, and scholastic terminology. So Heidegger's notion of Sein is akin to esse rather than ens, but it's not synonymous with esse in a metaphysical sense. This is a phenomenological interpretation of being and the question of being, not a metaphysical one. So there's a real difference here. So being can never be found as uncovered or exposed. Only beings can and must be. So this distinction between being and beings or entities, the distinction in German between Sein and Seienden. So therefore, being, Sein, is perceptibly palpable and detectable by Dasein, not in the same sensuous way as beings are, as this spaghetti on the plate, as this Ferris wheel I'm riding, as this emotion I'm feeling, as this idea I'm thinking about. But this is to quote from Being and Time, section 2. Heidegger says, in the fact that something is, and in its being as it is, in reality, in presence at hand, in subsistence, in validity, in Dasein, in the es gibt, in the it gives. So Sein is noticeable by Dasein in the factuality that something is the case, in what we call reality. and what we might say, presence at hand. That this book is present at hand. My interaction with this givenness of this phenomenon and all of the essential phenomena giving itself within the experience itself points me to that horizon from which all of these givens appear on the stage of this dramatics of being. The inquiry of the analytic design, subjectivity, selfhood, is so absolute and fundamental for Heidegger that any subjective terms regarding Dasign's inquiry into it and the world's reason for being must be bracketed out in order to prevent the blocking of any interrogation of the being of Dasein and to avoid the Cartesian Hegelian metaphysics of subjectivity, to use a phrase from Jacques Derrida in his book of Spirit. So these terms and these concepts of Heidegger, says Derrida in his analysis of Heidegger, these terms and concepts such as soul, spirit, consciousness, ego, person, that are very metaphysically laden terms, have no rights in an analytic of design, which seeks to determine the entity which we ourselves are. Again, it's a very careful distinction between this metaphysical language of being and this phenomenological uptake of the Seinsfrage. We see the language of being all over Heidegger's phenomenological work, but it's not used in a metaphysical sense. This is the distinction we always have to be making here. So it's thinking being anew, thinking being freshly. So Derrida says that all of these metaphysical terms have no rights in an analytic of design because the metaphysical terms have already answered all of Dasign's questions. Metaphysics, classical metaphysics, is an index of answers. And so if you want to cut to the chase in philosophy, and the cliff notes, we used to call them, like the summary points, the punchlines of the answer to all the philosophical questions we ask, there they are in metaphysics. There they are. But in a sense, classical metaphysics is the spoiler for philosophy, because we find out how the story ends before we even begin the journey. Isn't that miserable if you were going to watch a film and you start with the ending? You can't do that. You start with a book and you read the last pages, it's ruined. The vivacity of the ending, the dynamism of the ending, and the whole story for that matter is ruined because we jumped to the end. For philosophy, what Heidegger is getting at is the prioritization of the question, of the problematic, to continue to prioritize it and renew it, in as much as the dynamism of being is to show itself and conceal itself. So even for classical metaphysics, this Heideggerian philosophy contests it and says, isn't there something still to be discovered, still to be asked? And the index of answers of metaphysics is going through and says, hang on. Well, we've asked that, we've answered that, asked that, answered that. And classical metaphysics is perennial philosophy, which is the actual bedrock of Western philosophy, is done much heavy lifting throughout the centuries. It has much to say. Even thinking of a more theological figure like Thomas Aquinas and his summas and all the questions and answers and questions and answers. Did he ask everything there's to be asked? And for philosophy, it's even if someone asked something before in pre-Socratic times, we have to ask it still today. as if we never asked it before. Not to be ignorant of the philosophical heritage, but to be open to new methods, new approaches, new grammars, a new development of doctrine within the field of philosophy. This is what's happening in contemporary philosophy, especially from Descartes on. This turn toward subjectivity and an investigation of this, all these enigmatics of subjectivity and experience itself. And we get all these different doctrines developing: empiricism, idealism, existentialism. And we have a method like phenomenology that can't be pinned down as an ism. As Jean-Luc Marion once said, it's not a set of doctrines, it's a toolbox. Phenomenology, we have tools to use, methodological tools to use to ask questions better with more precision, clarity, not assuming too much. This is what Heidegger is doing with the great question of Western philosophy, the question of being. Typically put for metaphysics, was ist Sein? What is being? But for Heidegger, this is not the way to ask this in phenomenology. We don't ask, what is it? We ask, was es gibt? What does it give? Was es weltet? How does the world world? Not what is it, not does it exist, but how do we experience it? This is Aragnas. Question, Imran, thanks so much. Could I speculate on the process for Heidegger to trace the movement of Dasein toward greater awareness of its ipseity? Is it like Cartesian meditation, anthropology, or something else? It's a great question. Thanks so much. And as to kind of dovetail with what I was just saying, for Heidegger, for genuine philosophy, all of the above. Does philosophy involve anthropology? Yes. Cartesian meditation? Yes. Other things? Yes. So philosophy, we think about a figure like Heidegger and we try to think along with him, as well as thinking along with other ones that are saying different things and have different approaches. But as you ask about Heidegger's movement of Dasein toward greater awareness of his ipseity, how does this happen? Number one, by raising the Seinsfrage in a phenomenological tenor for Heidegger. So how do we raise the question of being through phenomenology? Because being, we're suspicious of being as phenomenologists. It's like a Trojan horse that wants to enter the city and unleash all the metaphysical index of answers. And we're like, no, we don't want to use the language of being because it implies too much. It has too much baggage. We can't do phenomenology anymore if we start using the language of being. But Heidegger is trying to do just that without regarding being and the question of being as a Trojan horse that will ruin contemporary open-ended philosophy by all of this metaphysical baggage that it imports inside of it. So Dasein gets to know itself better in as much as it's getting to know being better. And to get to know being better is to realize how much I don't know about being. And so the more I realize how much there is I don't know about being, the paradox is the more I learn about myself and my authentic possibilities as a questioner of being, an interrogator of being. The more I interrogate being, the more I become as Dasein. The privilege of Dasein is to ask questions, not in a skeptical way. This is not pure skepticism where it's like anything that smacks of an answer, I deflect. But it's receiving answer, it's receiving clarity, it's receiving phenomena as they give themselves in all this givenness, but at the same time, perceiving the abyss underneath, behind, beyond every phenomenon that gives itself. So that the more this eragness is happening, the more that I understand my own lived experience this way, the more I become myself, understand myself in this privileged position vis-a-vis Sein, being. And the way I approach being and the way I let being approach me is through the Seinsfrage, is through the critical, analytic inquiry about its phenomenality. And again, for the phenomenological method, as we learned from Husserl, it is so open-ended and unlimited. Even when it comes to interpretation and description, we can go on and on and on and on and on. And that's the nature of givenness. There's always more angles, more ways to receive and describe a given phenomenon. All the more so when we're talking about the horizon of phenomenality itself and all of its hermeneutical layers. So Dasein is enmeshed, as I said earlier, in a density of revelation, the revelation of being. Not, I want to say of ontological revelation. Okay, I'll use that. But not ontology understood as classical metaphysics. You could say phenomenological ontology. For myself, as a phenomenologist, I don't like to use that kind of description because I think, again, I'm too suspicious of the blend of classical metaphysics and phenomenology into something, a sublation of method in which each starts to fail to do what it does so well. So as I continue to present, I will bring out, what does metaphysics have to do with phenomenology? What does phenomenology have to do with metaphysics? These are big methodological questions for us today in a post-Heideggerian context. But we have to still just think of Heidegger first. Okay, so Dasein must be neutral for Heidegger in order to be self-authentic. The opening of the questioning of being rules within the inescapable realm of lived experience, Erlebnis, and the ensuing appropriation of lived experience in its eventfulness, not only its meanings, but how meaning means. This is Ereignis by the analytic Dasein. So it does involve a critique of the history of philosophy from the standpoint of phenomenology. Is a process to understand Heidegger's exposition of Dasein's movement toward authenticity. Yeah, I think, Imran, you're right about that. Heidegger, it's such a breakthrough work, Sein und Zeit, that, it's an upending. And this is what we get with breakthrough philosophy. In some way, it's an upending of the whole heritage of Western philosophy. We get this with Husserl in his own way. We get this with Marion in his own way. We get this with Edith Stein in her own way. For Marion, for example, it's posing the question of love and the erotic phenomenon in the face of all of this, what could seem dry philosophical investigation and deliberation that never seems to be able to ask the question of love, even within the questioning epistemological questions, empirical questions, experiential questions, existential questions. Where's the question about love? So that's what Marion is bringing to things. Levinas, his breakthrough with what about the question of ethics? What about positioning ethics as first philosophy? This is something radically different than Heidegger. It turns Heidegger on his head. And so this is what we see in philosophy is to get at the radicality of the question, the radicality of truth, the radicality of givenness, the radicality of experience, the radicality of methodological development within the tradition of philosophy. We get uh, we get this great sparring that happens, pacific, peaceful sparring for the sake of truth between interlocutors across the tradition. And then we find these new breakthrough insights that come up. And we see that, like, when you study with your rabbi, so to speak, your master, you take what he or she has taught you, and then you also challenge and critique deficiencies you see in his or her thought. But you do so in a very charitable way, in a very generous way, um, in a way that you're both learning and learning more through critique. This is what happens with every figure, standing on the shoulders of the previous one in the history. So, the unconditional character of faith. Now, this is a quote from Heidegger's work, What is Called Thinking. He says, the unconditional character of faith, like religious faith, and the problematic character of thinking are two spheres separated by an abyss, Heidegger says. So he's laying down his cards: methodological atheism, religious indifference. He is not going to um, uh, bring in any reference to questions about God, God's revelations, any religious tradition. He's bracketing all of that. He sees that as part of bracketing the natural attitude. Marion will challenge him on that. Ricoeur will challenge him on that. Levinas will challenge him on that. And Edith Stein would challenge him on that in the maturity of her work. And many, Emmanuel Falk, other thinkers to the present, will challenge Heidegger on this point, that there's an unconditional character of faith demanding full assent of intellect and will to this proposal of divine revelation. That's one thing. But there's a problematic character of thinking, of what he's calling philosophy, rational thought, and these two things are separated by an abyss. Now, this is a dramatic conclusion reached by a long history of the cleavage and drifting between faith and reason. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, for instance, and I think the same can be said about Islam and other religious traditions, that there's a unity between faith and reason, of revelation and nature. That we think of a figure like Augustine of Hippo, and for him, he didn't say, on one hand we have philosophy, on the other hand we have theology. For Augustine, we just have seeking truth in its fullness. There's not this distinction made. It's not until scholasticism and the birth of the universities that we start to have a differentiation of fields of study, thinking of the liberal arts, the quadrivium, mathematics, geometry, astronomy, music, and the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, or grammar, dialectic, rhetoric. And we have these fields, and then we have medicine, and then we have law, and then we have metaphysics, also called philosophy, and then we have the sacred science called theology. And it's like you graduate from one to the other. You have a curriculum that's differentiating all these things. And now in modern times, we have the silo effect, where people can know all about biology, but nothing about theology. People can know all about business, but not much about philosophy. And so the idea of the university is breaking down in modern times for many cultural trending reasons, in terms of a lack of enrollments in programs. And so there's a breakdown of the unity of truth. What we have is expertise in topics and fields. So even Heidegger betrays this modern fragmentation of truth. And Heidegger wants to distance. Basically, theology is one thing, philosophy is another. But when we look back on the history of things, this was not always the case. And so I would advocate for a hermeneutics of retrieval, where we're going back to retrieve and reestablish the unity of thought, of experience, of learning, that it's very interdisciplinary, not just as a kind of a kind of battle cry of academia for liberal arts, but yes, liberal arts, all of the above. If we want to think toward the whole, we need all the parts of the whole. And theology is one of them. It's missing in Heidegger. And it affects how he thinks, and it affects his conclusions. So I'm not, in doing a phenomenology of Heidegger, I'm trying not to pass any judgment about him along the way. Though, if you wanted me to do that, I certainly could and would. But I don't want that judgment to pollute the phenomenological investigation of the phenomenology he is doing, which, as Husserl established it, as a field of neutral researches from the start. So with Heidegger, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. I want to give him a fair shake. I want to interpret him as Heidegger, and not try to talk about him through a lens that I'm bringing into things. So just a couple more points for this live stream. For Heidegger, the problem of faith vis-a-vis philosophical thinking is that an a priori answering to the question of being hinders or even usurps Dasein's neutral freedom and agency to inquire about the question of being. So from a book here, a quote from Ben Vedder's book of 2007, Heidegger's Philosophy of Religion, From God to the Gods. Vedder writes, only a ratio that abandons the revelation of faith is capable of actualizing the philosophical way of thinking. The existential, in the Ranerian, spelled with two L's at the end, existential, commitment to faith alone will never find the formal indications for understanding the ontological structure of factical Dasein. Only through the ontological analysis, for Heidegger, does it become understandable that theology presupposes something that is not pre-given in Dasein or in being. The question of being does not exist for the believer because this question is already answered out of faith. So that's very powerful how Ben Vedder puts that. And there's some truth about that. For the believer, we don't ask the question of being as if there's not already some doctrinal answer concerning its enigma. The person of faith, say Christianity, for example, the question of being is in some ways subsumed under the question of salvation. Like what happens when I die? And in Christianity, it says what happens when you die. The soul and the body are separated through this metaphysical understanding of things, and then you'll be judged by God, and there's heaven, there's hell, and for Catholicism, and there's the purification process called purgatory, and so you'll be judged, and there's particular judgment and final judgment, and this is what will happen. For Heidegger, he talks about being toward death as if I don't know. I don't know what will happen when I die. For his methodological atheism, it's unknown. Even like Heidegger, he's too elusive for empiricism. He's not assuming too much empirically either. For empirical atheism, this might be the presumption that when you die, that's it. All there is. Your body decomposes. You are no more. But for this philosophical atheism, it simply means that either we're not going to ask the question of God or look to any alleged revelation of God, and or If we ask the question or approach the concept of divinity at all, it will be calling it into question again and again and again, and essentially being an atheist in relation to this concept of God, that concept of God, this other concept of God. And we see that in Levinas to some degree, that this kind of positivity of atheism in order not to treat the infinity of divinity as an idol, which the concept itself is saying it's not containable, it's not finite, it's not a phenomenon even. So if phenomenology is an investigation of phenomena and the phenomenality of phenomena within lived experience, divinity, going back to Kant, is a limit concept for this method. It's a postulate of pure reason, and we hit that ceiling, and we can't say anything more past there if our method itself is determining its own parameters in advance. So this is what we have in Heidegger. It doesn't mean it's the only way to do philosophy, but it's the way he's doing it. And but we study Heidegger, we read Heidegger to draw benefit from what's going on there and to understand better this tradition. If we want to understand phenomenology, could we understand the history of phenomenology without Heidegger? No. That would be a great mistake, a great lacuna in trying to study this history if we don't make some reference to Heidegger. So for Heidegger, all must halt before the supreme analytic Dasein in order to arrive at what Heidegger calls in the Grundprobleme der Phänomenologie, the understanding of the being of this being, projecting upon the mode of its unconcealedness, Unverborgenheit. So, Dasein is the supreme analytic in Heidegger, so that we could arrive at an understanding of Sein as the being of the phenomenon, the being of the entity, the being of the thing itself, the being of the presence at hand. There's a being of the being. There's a phenomenality of the phenomenon that is projecting upon the mode of its unconcealedness. Dasein projects upon the mode of the unconcealedness of the thing itself as phenomenon in its givenness. But again, so much giving, so much hiding for Heidegger. The phenomenon gives itself to high degree, but hides itself to high degree. Being, Sein, gives itself to the givenness of phenomena, that Gegebenheit, but at the same time remains the horizon of givenness. It remains concealed. There remains a transcendence. There remains the beyond. There remains the abyss of Sein that we never can get to the bottom of. Dasein for Heidegger must remain unhampered by any sort of theological language, conclusions that would impose themselves on the open question of being in an a priori way. So the agency of Dasein in Heidegger, the agency and purview of Dasein is absolute, exercising an absolute hermeneutic task at the service of the self-disclosure of being. So it's interesting in Heidegger that we don't have the self. Well, this is careful to say. And I like the comment, thank you, Michael. Heidegger sounds like a Buddhist. Yeah, there's something very akin to Eastern mysticism, concepts like nirvana and this kind of transcendence, whether it's a kind of being dissolved into the one or a kind of heightened state of existence, a kind of mysticism. With Heidegger, people have talked about a kind of philosophical mysticism. We can say this about phenomenology on the whole, that it's like this. It tends toward contemplation, and with contemplation comes visions, locutions, rapture, ecstasy, transport, bilocation. Like all these different paranormal phenomena, and what theology would call supernatural phenomena. But philosophy itself, even thinking of Plotinus and his Aeneids, there's a mystical ascent going on. And we see this in some ways in Hegel, in this Aufhebung, and something that's lifting. And we're entering into the mysterious sea of transcendence in one way or another in philosophy. And this is why many people in the world don't like philosophy, because it's too unnerving. Gives too much vertigo. It's like, well, if I think about thinking too much, I might lose my mind. Yeah, it's a real possibility in philosophy, and we see this happening with some people like Nietzsche. As David Tracy, I was sitting in class with him once at University of Chicago, and he was teaching about Nietzsche, and he said Nietzsche was one who stared so much into the abyss that he fell into it. So I would recommend temperance in philosophy, so we can take time to think, we can take time to ask deep questions, but then let's go for a jog, let's enjoy a good meal, and let's get back to what Levinas calls the jouissance of life that has its place, not as an absolute, but to temper the rigor of thought so that it doesn't fatigue itself to the point of exhaustion. So that's a very important thing, I think, for us who dare to philosophize, that we need to come up for air. So that's good. Imran asks, I wonder how Heidegger can inquire about what is unconcealed in ecstatic experience and revelation, given his methodological bracketing. Yeah, I'm kind of using a analogy from theology when I'm talking about this thing. So I'm not saying that this is exactly what's happening in Heidegger, that he's at his desk and going into mystical ecstasy. But what I am saying is that his very line of thought expands in such ways that we have what Marion will eventually call a saturation of meaning and a saturation of thought. And that itself has a mystical kind of quality about it. Yeah, as you say, Michael, Heidegger definitely can help as we approach literature, as we approach language. As Heidegger said, language is the house of being. So with Heidegger, we get a lot more attentiveness than Husserl to hermeneutical questions. And these will be taken up by Heidegger's student Gadamer, Hans-Georg Gadamer, by Paul Ricoeur, I would say above all, the hermeneutic phenomenologist par excellence, Paul Ricoeur. And I'm definitely going to present on his phenomenology coming up in the future, where we have a hermeneutical turn in phenomenology with Heidegger, definitely. And as I point out in this book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist, I talk about we have two genealogical traditions in phenomenology that branch off with Heidegger. This is on page 6 of the book. But you could see here that I talk about, we can observe on one hand a phenomenology of givenness, which is Husserl's beginning. We have students like Edith Stein, who are in her own category because she combines something like classical metaphysics with phenomenology. But we have the strict phenomenologist that runs through Heidegger. But then with Heidegger and this hermeneutical turn, we have two different, roads diverge here. And we have the hermeneutical phenomenology with Gadamer, Ricoeur, Levinas, and Derrida. And we have that phenomenology of givenness or manifestation that goes on with Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Michel Henry, Jean-Luc Marion. It's very clear when you study all these people's work, we have two different things going on. And I tease these out in this book within the context of religious experience. But it's first of all important to know the genealogy of the phenomenology well, and the payoffs we have through these different thinkers. So, as you say, Michael, I think Heidegger is very helpful to approach a text, a work of art, language itself with a very fresh perspective. Late Heidegger gets very poetic. Heidegger has a beautiful meditation on a work of art called The Peasant's Shoes. And it's just a pair of shoes of a hardworking peasant woman, I think. And I've seen it before. And he meditates on does a phenomenology of the work of art, and it's just bursting with meaning. And someone who doesn't think phenomenologically might come across the work of art and say, a pair of shoes, a pair of old worn shoes, next, moving on. But for a Heideggerian analytic of design and approaching the self-disclosure of meaning in the work of art, it's so much givenness is just bursting forth there. So it is a great benefit of studying Heidegger and thinking about this. It moves us into a place of wonder. And so to recapitulate from where I started, for Heidegger, we have the movement of general experience, as Erlebnis is the German term, toward a dynamic experience, a dynamism of experience, as there's a revelation taking place, specifically a revelation of being, Sein, as an event, as a hermeneutical event of appropriation of the self-revelation of Sein that awakens Dasein to its most authentic possibilities for living. And this self-disclosure of Sein comes through Seienden, which are, aka phenomenon, also known as phenomena, or also we could say beings, not in a metaphysical sense, but in a phenomenological self-giving sense. So being, Sein gives itself through beings or entities. We also say phenomena. In the Umwelt, the context, the womb, the symbolic order of lived experience. So these are some important concepts for understanding Heidegger, how he's different, his work is different than that of Husserl, and then how thinkers who come after Heidegger will be different than Heidegger as well. There's a lot of differences to make in talking about different approaches of phenomenology. They're not all the same, even though they have the same foundation, going back to Husserl. So you can't say you're a phenomenologist if in some way you're not related back to Husserl. And at this point in history, the same would be said about Heidegger. You have to know some things about Heidegger to do phenomenology in terms of the broadening of its possibilities, and then to understand what is Levinas doing, what is Ricoeur doing, what is Marion doing, all the way up until the present. It's people who are working in the field now are making new breakthroughs in light of the breakthroughs of history, the breakthroughs of the past. And so we don't make breakthroughs, or we don't make them well, when we are ignorant of the former breakthroughs in a field in which we are working, thinking. So thank you so much for joining me on this live stream. If there's any more questions, I'd be happy to entertain them, to think more together, to dialogue more together. I wanted to do some live streaming presenting Heidegger. And eventually, I think next we'll be turning to Marion very heavily. There's much more to explore in Marion's work. Again, I had the privilege to study with him at University of Chicago. He was on my dissertation committee. He wrote the foreword to my book, which originally was my dissertation work, much substantially revised and things, and turned into this book. But I love the work of Marion and want to relate him back to Heidegger and Husserl. And then I also will plan to do much on Levinas. I wrote another book on Levinas called Emmanuel, Levinas, and Variations on God with us. Yeah, it's so. Thank you, Michael, for subscribing to the channel. Thank you, Monk Simon, for participating. Thank you, Imran. I love the dialogue we're getting going. I think the sound is working better today. I changed out the microphone. I'm not trying to share my screen and just make it so it's good to hear. You could listen to this as a podcast. You can watch it as a video. All of the videos I do are put in podcasts, so you can also just listen to them through a mobile device or in the car, as well as watch the video. Um, so yeah, Chicago's a great place to be. University of Chicago is a great place of learning, a great history of these phenomenologists there, thinking about Paul Ricoeur, Jean-Luc Marion, uh, philosophy of religion with David Tracy, Mircea Eliade, Paul Tillich was there, uh, many others, Bernard McGinn and Christian mysticism. And University of Chicago, I think, is so rich in investigating different religious traditions, interreligious dialogue, and that's very good. That's very beneficial. But yeah, it's interesting. Marion, he he would come to Chicago for 1 quarter out of the school year and teach a couple courses there in the divinity school in Swift Hall. And otherwise, he was in Paris. He taught at the Sorbonne in France, and but like Ricoeur, he would come to Chicago from France and teach. And so there's a whole tradition I like to call the Chicago School there at the University of Chicago and surrounding area. It's very influenced a lot of my professors at Loyola University Chicago, where I actually got my doctorate. Studied with David Tracy and Paul Ricoeur, and so I was taught phenomenology through that line of disciples, you could say. And but Mario now is like retired and not coming to teach at University of Chicago anymore. I was fortunate to sit in on his last some of his last lectures in class with him there um, a couple years ago, and it was a wonderful time. I got to know him outside the classroom too. We ate at this nice restaurant called what's it called? In English, you'd say it's a small world. Piccolo Mundo, I think it is, right off campus on the south side of Chicago. So if you look up online, Piccolo Mundo, it's a great restaurant. Highly recommended. I ate dinner with Jean-Luc and his wife Corinne. Yeah, now a few years back. But and also Jean-Luc and I went to Bar David right off campus too. That's another great restaurant. And I asked him. We had great conversation, and I asked, how was the steak? He said, he's very picky with the food, but he recommended once to me the noodles with oil. Just that there's something great about the basic noodles with oil. But in any case, very thankful for him. It's really wonderful that he's still living, still working, thinking, writing, and so I just like to share about how I've been enriched in studying philosophy, eventually theology. I think we have a lot more interest on the channel in philosophy right now and phenomenology. So I will stay with that for a while. But I also want to do things on classical metaphysics, which I think is just as important as phenomenology. So when I'm commentating on these phenomenologists, it can sound like I'm in that camp, so to speak, but I think good philosophy doesn't have a camp. It thinks toward the whole, and so it's going to gather up from across these methods and thinkers as much as it can. Right now, I'm reading a lot about Hildegard of Bingen, this 12th century Benedictine nun visionary. And she was a woman who really thought toward the whole. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, she's one of the premier ones. And trying to read about her more, read her work, read commentaries on her work. There's a great scholar at Northwestern University on Hildegard. And I've got her book right here, Barbara Newman, Sister of Wisdom. I'm reading through that excellent written book. And just, studying the work of Edith Stein. I wrote a book on her. So all this, I just encourage, like, to think toward the whole is to spread out one's thought and not be too myopic, not be too concentrated in just one thinker or one line of thought or one method of philosophy, but to learn across all of these various trajectories to better, think toward the whole and thereby live toward the whole. So thank you again, everyone, for joining me today on this live stream. I appreciate your presence so much. I really love what's happening on the channel and more dialogue getting going, more interaction. And I think we have a lot of great things in store into the future. And your participation is motivation for me to keep doing this. Try to go on, 5 days a week or so and get about an hour live stream and keep the videos stacking up. And I continue to learn from so many different people too. So I think in our time, not only do we have writing as a way to communicate, but we have these kind of ways as a way to communicate and to keep seeking truth together. So may you continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you on the next one.